$535 million. That was the federal loan guarantee behind Solyndra, a thin-film solar manufacturer backed as part of America's clean energy push. In 2011, the company filed for bankruptcy, but that guarantee became a $535 million taxpayer exposure. The headline blamed the company. The forensic story runs deeper. When silicon prices fell and Chinese panels undercut the market, Solyndra's factory economics collapsed. A technology bet that looked rational in 2009 was facing commodity pressure by 2011. The financing structure had been built for speed. It had no real shock absorbers for market compression. The fallout migrated from the balance sheet to Congress. Hearings followed. Executives invoked the Fifth Amendment rather than answering committee questions. The company's failure had become a political event. But before any of that happened, Solyndra looked like the future. So how did a bet this large get designed with so little protection? The decision does not begin as obvious recklessness. Solyndra is a thin-film solar panel manufacturer entering a period when U.S. policymakers are pushing hard for domestic clean energy capacity, supply chain resilience, and technical leadership. Across the wider sector, momentum is real. Solar later accounts for 66% of new U.S. electricity capacity additions and supports more than 280,000 jobs. In that climate, the premise behind federal support is straightforward. Frontier companies can carry national strategic value while still looking too risky for conventional private financing. A loan guarantee is designed to close that gap, accelerating deployment before incumbents and imports lock the market. But rational intent is not the same as robust risk design. The $535 million DOE guarantee helps finance speed and scale, while also relocating downside exposure toward the public balance sheet if performance fails. That structure can work when technical progress and market prices move in compatible directions. Here, they do not. Solyndra's differentiation depends on a cost position that becomes fragile as silicon prices fall rapidly and lower-cost Chinese panel competition intensifies. The policy narrative emphasizes innovation urgency. The control framework appears less prepared for a fast commodity price reversal. That is the blind spot: confidence in technology without equal protection against market compression. So the early decision can look coherent inside the moment, even as its safeguards are thinner than the story surrounding it. If the premise is speed and the market moves faster than the model, what fails first, the company or the architecture meant to protect the public? Federal backing does more than provide capital. It certifies belief. With a $535 million loan guarantee in place, Solyndra is no longer treated as a standalone startup risk. It is framed as part of a national push to scale clean energy, expand domestic capability, and move faster than private credit alone would permit. In fast policy cycles, that signal matters. It attracts attention, aligns institutions, and compresses dissent because urgency becomes a strategic argument. Later sector outcomes, solar reaching 66% of new U.S. capacity additions and supporting more than 280,000 jobs, help explain why confidence in acceleration feels plausible at the time. But momentum can hide concentration risk. Solyndra's competitive logic rests on one vulnerable premise: that its thin film design can hold economic ground in a market where input prices and global supply conditions are shifting hard. When that premise weakens, the guarantee structure does not absorb volatility. It transmits failure to the public side of the ledger. After the 2011 bankruptcy and default, scrutiny intensifies, hearings follow, and executives are reported invoking the Fifth Amendment rather than answering committee questions. The pattern is now clearer than it was in real time. Policy symbolism and financing speed moved in sync, while resilience testing lagged behind. Confidence was visible. Fragility was too, but it was discounted. Then the market moved hard, and the economics behind the story began to collapse. The break is not gradual. It is a price shock. Silicon prices fall fast, and the market suddenly reprices around cheaper conventional panels, including lower-cost Chinese supply. Solyndra's thin film design may still be technically distinct, but distinction does not defend unit economics when the industry cost curve drops out from under you. The floor gives way first. The story catches up second. The strategic error is now exposed. The financing was built around innovation risk, but the larger threat was commodity compression. When that compression hits, margin disappears first, then optionality. What looked like a differentiated model now behaves like a high-cost position in a low-price market. At that point, execution discipline cannot outrun arithmetic. In 2011, the company files for bankruptcy, and the default lands directly on the $535 million federal guarantee. This is where operational stress turns into a public finance event. A private business failure would normally burn equity, restructure debt, and contain the damage. Here, the downside migrates into a government-backed credit structure, and taxpayers inherit the consequence. That transmission mechanism is the real control failure. The system speeds deployment on the way up, but has weak shock absorbers when market prices move against the thesis. The machine was built for lift, not impact. The aftermath turns institutional almost immediately. Congressional investigations intensify. Executives are reported invoking the Fifth Amendment rather than answering committee questions, deepening suspicion that warning signals may have been visible earlier than acknowledged. The outrage is not just about one bankruptcy. It is about whether this stress scenario was foreseeable and insufficiently governed. And once that question enters Washington, the collapse is no longer just financial, it becomes political. But who pays for that second collapse? After Solyndra's $535 million default and bankruptcy, the battlefield expands to Congress. At a House Energy and Commerce Subcommittee hearing, scrutiny centers on the decision process, not just financial loss. Executives previously expected to testify, CEO Brian Harrison and CFO W.G. Stover Jr., instead invoke the Fifth Amendment and decline to answer questions. Lawmakers say they had been assured of voluntary testimony. Committee leaders, including Fred Upton and Cliff Stearns, publicly object to the reversal. That turn fractures two forms of trust at once. First, trust in corporate stewardship. When senior officers refuse to answer under congressional scrutiny, observers infer hidden exposure, whether or not any single allegation is ultimately proven. Second, trust in program oversight. If a federally backed deal can fail at this scale, then screening, monitoring, and escalation controls appear weaker than presented. The political response is immediate. Democratic members of the House Energy and Commerce Committee vote to halt new loan guarantee applications, converting one company's collapse into a broader policy break. The longer consequence is strategic, not just partisan. A single default can reset risk appetite across Washington, shaping how future public financing is structured, reviewed, and opposed. Even as the wider solar sector later shows substantial growth, 66% of new U.S. capacity additions and more than 280,000 jobs, Solyndra remains a caution signal inside budget rooms and committee hearings. The damage is no longer only financial, it is institutional memory. So what is the durable lesson? Retreat from public financing, or rebuild it with harder risk governance before the next crisis? The lesson lands after the wreckage. Public credit can speed strategic technology when private capital hesitates. But speed is exactly what can turn judgment brittle. Urgency, signaling, and national ambition compress dissent. So a guaranteed loan starts to look like an engine for momentum rather than a contingent liability. The hidden fragility sits elsewhere. Stress tests often focus on whether the company can execute, while underweighting whether the market itself can change under its feet. In Solyndra's case, thin film differentiation depended on economics that could be overturned by global price moves. When silicon prices fell and cheaper imports expanded, the core assumption broke faster than the financing structure could adjust. The floor gave way before the guardrails even mattered. Then the operating problem became a public one. The 2011 bankruptcy turned company stress into a federal credit event, and $535 million in exposure became the number that defined the story. Investigations, hearings, and Fifth Amendment silence hardened institutional mistrust. The case was cited again and again as a risk transfer failure. The upside is celebrated early, but the bill arrives late, in full view of the public. The result was bigger than one loss. It was retrenchment, stricter scrutiny, less tolerance for future programs, even in sectors that later proved they could scale. The control framework is blunt. For founders, technical novelty is not protection if cost curves move against you faster than your runway can hold. For policymakers and investors, support should be staged with dynamic risk gates, scenario reviews, and hard limits on taxpayer downside, not built on one-time optimism. In other words, don't just ask whether the company works. Ask whether the world around it can break the model first. If strategic sectors are inherently volatile, where should public courage end and preventable public loss begin?